If you were to live in a medieval village, the mill would be one of the most important places, not just for food, but for community. Mills were often placed right on the edge of the settlement, where the river ran strong enough to turn the wheel, or in windier regions, on a hilltop where the wind could catch the great white sails of a windmill. The building itself was sturdy, often built of timber beams filled with wattle and daub, its large wheel creaking gently as water or wind provided the power. Inside, the smell was unmistakable, a mix of freshly ground flour, the faint mustiness of grain stored in sacks, and the earthy scent of wooden beams darkened by years of flour dust. A miller's work began early. Before the sun was high, he was already inside, checking the millstones, adjusting the gears, and making sure the great wheel turned smoothly. The sound was constant, a low, rumbling hum. The miller's life was both simple and complex. Simple because it was tied to the rhythms of the village. The seasons decided when grain came in, when the harvest was busy, and when the mill was quieter. Complex because the mill was a piece of engineering in a world where most work was done by hand. The miller had to understand the river, how fast the water ran after a rainstorm, how low it would fall in summer. He knew the sound of the millstones when they were grinding well, and the sound when something was wrong. He was part craftsman, part mechanic, and part businessman, for he was often paid not in coins, but in a share of the flour he ground. Milling was dusty work. Flour would cling to the miller's clothes, his hair, his eyebrows, until it looked as though he were dusted in snow. Villagers might joke about this, but they respected his skill. Without him, the golden sheaves of wheat from the fields were useless. The miller was more than just a tradesman. He was a node in the web of the village's life. Farmers brought in heavy sacks of grain on carts pulled by oxen or donkeys. The miller would weigh the grain, note the amount, and set to work. Children might linger by the mill door, peeking in to watch the great turning stones. Sometimes the miller's wife would hand them a little piece of bread, fresh from her oven, still warm. The sound of the wheel turning became part of the village's soundtrack. It meant things were working, that the harvest was feeding the people, that life was continuing as it always had. And when the mill fell silent, in winter or during repairs, there was an emptiness to the air inside the mill. There were many tools, not the shining metal ones we think of today, but simple, sturdy instruments made from wood, leather, and stone. The heart of the mill was, of course, the great pair of millstones. The lower stone stayed still, while the upper stone rotated, driven by the water wheel or wind sails outside. The stones were dressed, that is, grooved, in careful patterns to help grind the grain more efficiently. A good miller knew how to sharpen these grooves with a tool called a mill bill, a job that required patience, precision, and a steady hand. Nearby, wooden hoppers held the grain, before it fell gently down into the stones. Long-handled brushes swept the ground flour into waiting sacks. The air was never still inside a working mill. There was always but gentle vibration, a faint rumble, the rustle of grain, and the quiet swish of brushes. Like the farmers, the miller's life was shaped by the seasons. In late summer and early autumn, when the harvest came in, the mill was at its busiest. The days were long. The wheel turned from dawn until the evening light faded, and the sacks of grain seemed endless. In the quiet months of winter, work slowed. Snow might drift along the riverbank. The wheel might freeze in place on the coldest mornings, and the miller would spend more time repairing tools, sharpening stones, and tending to small chores. Sometimes he would help mend the village's bridges or lend a hand to the carpenter. Spring brought new grain from the first barley harvest. Summer meant the fields swayed again in green and gold. And so the rhythm continued, year after year, slow, dependable, and certain. The miller often lived close to his mill, sometimes even in the same building, with a small living space above or beside the grinding room. A miller's home was humble, but warm. A hearth for cooking, a table made from thick planks of oak, shelves lined with pottery jugs and wooden bowls, and perhaps, if times were good, a brightly woven cloth brought from the market in a nearby town. His wife would bake bread, not just for their own family, but often to share with neighbors or to sell in the village square. Children would grow up surrounded by the sounds of the mill. They would learn to sweep the floors, carry small sacks, or fetch water from the river. The work, the home, and the family life were all woven together into one gentle rhythm. Every so often, the miller would visit the nearest market town. There he might sell flour, buy new tools, or trade for goods that couldn't be made in the village. Market days were gentle social occasions, not loud or overwhelming, just a slow flow of people chatting, exchanging news, and swapping goods. The miller might bring small coins in a leather pouch and return with cloth, salt, or perhaps a little honey. He would greet other tradesmen, the blacksmith, the cooper who made barrels, the baker who relied on his flour. By the end of the day, he would head home along the winding road, the river glimmering beside him, the slow creak of the mill already audible in the distance.